Alright guys, we're back, and this is, I'm going to do my best to kind of go over this pipeline, and this is probably the most unique thing to this new tutorial, is the pipeline itself, because I've covered, I'm pretty sure I've covered items and a good degree of the spider functionality in past tutorials, but I do not think that I've covered the pipeline all that much, if at all, in past lectures. So I'm going to do that here, and really what a pipeline does is it's intended to kind of be the final middleware between your spider and the output data. It cleans the data, and it also is kind of the mechanism by which you save out the data. And in this case, I'm saving the data to an sqlite 3 database. An SQLite is basically just a simplified version of SQL or MySQL that you can actually store locally. It's pretty convenient, and Python has a pretty simplistic API for it, so I've used that here, and I'm kind of new to it as well, so I was just kind of messing around with it. But without further ado, let me kind of walk you through what this system does. So first of all, I'm importing SQLite 3, and I'm defining it as a variable named light, which makes it kind of simpler to access if I need to access it. And then I'm creating this con object, which is really just representing the database connection, which I'll kind of get into in a bit, what that actually means and what it does. And then I'm defining the class tutorial pipeline and its extending object, which is just the base Python object. Then I'm doing a function call to init, which is just the basic constructor function. Does some preliminary setup that I wanted to do before it runs any of the built-in functions or whatever. Process items is a function that Scrapy has actually created for us, and I've just added mechanisms to it. So basically it just comes in and it says return item. That's what it does by default. Nothing exciting. But what I'm doing in this is I'm iterating over all of the items, so all of these, and I'm saying for each one I'm stripping the HTML out of them if there's any HTML, and if it's a blank item, it's just stripping out, or it's just making a blank string. That way it's easier to deal with the database. So it's just kind of cleaning some of the data a little bit, and that's all this really is doing right now. And then once it's done, it's calling store in DB, which is database. But let me first start off by going to the bottom here and sort of explaining some of this database mechanism system. So let's see, where did I set it up? Okay, so setup con. This is actually creating the database connection itself. This is probably the most important function. It's getting called in the init up here, setup con, and that's just setting up the database connection to your new local database that you're creating. So I'm calling light, which I defined at the top, and I'm saying, hey, connect. This is a function off of the SQLite 3 API. And I'm defining a database. I'm just calling test.db, and this is actually a real file. It's being saved with this project. So in this case, test.db. I have a program that actually opens it up that I really like. It's called I think it's called SQLite browser, but I could be wrong. And it's really handy. It allows me to kind of check my data and make sure it's populating correctly and stuff. But after I define the connection, I'm defining what's called a cursor, and the cursor is a way of accessing the functions in the database, so like creating tables and stuff like that. And if you're not familiar with how SQL works, don't worry about it. I'll probably make another series on that itself at some point, but basically it's just a way of storing data in a organized and simple way. So I'm defining this cursor right here, and since it's self.cursor or CUR, that's on the Python class object itself, so you can, or on the pipeline class object, sorry, itself, so you can actually access this variable anywhere inside of this class, which is handy since we're going to need that for pretty much all the functions in this class. And the other thing I want to mention before I get into some of the database specific code is this del function, which is a Python built-in function that you can override. And basically what it does is when this class is done being used by Scrapy or by the Python interpreter itself, it by default calls this function del. And this function, by overriding it, you can say, hey, I want to do some cleanup before this class is actually destroyed. And this is a really important thing when you're dealing with databases, because you can cause major memory leaks if you don't close out your database connections, because since this is a class, it could potentially be instantiated, 100 times or 10 times or whatever, and if you just keep leaving open SQL connections out there, it causes big memory leak issues, which you really do not want to deal with, because that'll slow down your system, it could potentially crash your program, all that sort of stuff. So basically all I'm doing is I'm calling a function when this class is deleted called closeDB, and this function is down here, and all it's doing is calling this con object that we defined up there and saying close. And that's a built-in function on the SQLite API. So that's fairly simple. All that is just to set up this database object. And from now on is kind of the more fun stuff that actually does useful stuff.